The funeral director stepped backward, his clipboard clattering to the ground as 200 mourners erupted in screams. A massive African lion, golden mane flowing in the Illinois breeze, walked slowly through the cemetery gates toward Dorothy Williams's open casket. This wasn't supposed to happen. Magnus was supposed to be safely contained at the Chicago Zoo, 300 miles away. Elderly guests stumbled over folding chairs, their walkers scraping against headstones as they fled. Children sobbed in their parents' arms while men shouted for someone to call animal control. The metallic taste of fear hung thick in the morning air. Michael Williams froze beside his mother's coffin, recognizing the distinctive scar across the lion's left shoulder, the same scar from the photographs Dorothy had sent from Kenya. His hands trembled as memories of their last argument flooded back. "You chose that animal over your own family!" "Nobody move!" the sheriff commanded, his voice cracking despite years of training. His radio buzzed frantically with dispatch calls. How had Magnus traveled from Chicago to rural Millfield, and why had he come to say goodbye to the woman who saved his life? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Dorothy Williams had always been told she was too stubborn for her own good. At 72, the retired Army nurse from Millfield, Illinois, had buried her husband Harold 15 years ago and watched her children drift away like autumn leaves. Michael, her eldest, had become a Wall Street lawyer who measured love in billable hours, while Sarah, her youngest, practiced pediatric medicine in Denver and called exactly twice a year, Christmas and Dorothy's birthday. The cancer diagnosis came on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered with the same clinical detachment Dorothy had once used to inform families about their loved ones. 6 months, maybe 8 with treatment, Dr. Patterson had said, his eyes avoiding hers. "I'm sorry, Dorothy. We caught it too late." That night, sitting in Harold's old recliner, Dorothy pulled out a weathered notebook, her bucket list, written 40 years ago when dreams seemed possible. Travel to Africa, see wild lions, make a difference. The pages were yellow with age, the ink faded, but the longing remained sharp as ever. "Harold always said I had magic hands with animals," she whispered to the empty house. "Guess it's never too late to prove him right." When Dorothy announced her plan to spend her remaining time in Kenya, the reaction was swift and brutal. Michael flew in from New York, his face flushed with the righteous anger of someone accustomed to winning arguments. "This is insanity, Mom. You're going to die in some God-forsaken place alone because you'd rather play with lions than spend time with your family." Sarah's response came via FaceTime, delivered between surgeries with the practiced efficiency of someone perpetually running late. "Mom, be reasonable. Use the money for experimental treatments. There are new therapies, clinical trials." But Dorothy had made her choice. She sold Harold's vintage Mustang, cashed in her modest 401k, and booked a one-way ticket to Nairobi. The morning she left, neither of her children came to say goodbye. James Kimani met her at Jomo Kenyatta Airport with a weathered smile and knowing eyes. A Maasai guide in his 50s, James had seen enough wealthy Americans seeking spiritual awakening in the African wilderness to recognize Dorothy's type, except something in her determined gait suggested she was different. "Welcome to Kenya, Mrs. Williams," he said, loading her single suitcase into his dusty Land Rover. "Are you ready for an adventure?" Dorothy looked out at the vast sky, breathing in the foreign air that somehow felt like coming home. "I've been ready my whole life, James. I just didn't know it until now." As they drove toward the Masai Mara, Dorothy clutched Harold's dog tags, the only thing she'd kept from his army service. Somewhere in these grasslands, 49 years ago, her husband had written in his journal about saving a lion cub. She'd found those pages after his funeral but never understood their significance. Now, with death as her traveling companion, Dorothy Williams was about to discover that some debts of gratitude span generations. The Masai Mara stretched endlessly before them, a golden ocean of grass that rippled in the morning breeze. Dorothy pressed her face against the Land Rover's window, watching zebras graze alongside Thompson's gazelles, while acacia trees dotted the landscape like ancient sentinels. This was what Harold had seen all those years ago, this raw, untamed beauty that no photograph could capture. There. James pointed toward a cluster of rocks near a dried riverbed. Lion pride. But something's wrong. Dorothy squinted through her bifocals and saw them. 5 lionesses pacing nervously around the rocks, their golden coats catching the sunlight. But it was the massive male lying motionless in the shade that made her breath catch. Even from a distance, she could see the dark stain spreading across his flank. "He's hurt," Dorothy said, her nurse's instincts overriding common sense. "James, we need to help him." James shook his head firmly. "Mrs. Williams, that is Magnus, the pride's dominant male. Very dangerous, even wounded. The females will attack if we approach." But Dorothy was already opening her medical kit, the same battered case she'd carried through field hospitals in Vietnam. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking supplies, antibiotics, gauze, surgical thread. "I've been patching up stubborn males for 50 years, James. This one just happens to have a mane." As they drew closer, the severity of Magnus's condition became apparent. A deep gash ran along his left shoulder, infected and festering. His breathing was labored, and his golden eyes held the dull resignation of an animal accepting death. The lionesses had retreated to give their fallen king space to die with dignity. "He's been abandoned by his pride," James whispered. In the wild, the weak cannot be saved. Dorothy felt a familiar fire ignite in her chest, the same determination that had driven her to work 18-hour shifts in military hospitals, the same stubborn refusal to accept defeat that had sustained her through Harold's cancer. "Well, he's not in the wild anymore. He's got himself an army nurse." Against James's frantic protests, Dorothy stepped out of the vehicle. Magnus lifted his massive head, amber eyes locking onto hers. For a moment that stretched into eternity, woman and beast regarded each other across an impossible divide. Dorothy expected fear, but instead felt an overwhelming sense of recognition, as if she were looking into the eyes of an old friend. "Easy, big boy," she murmured, approaching with the same calm confidence she'd used with frightened soldiers. "I'm not here to hurt you." Magnus watched her approach, but made no move to attack. When Dorothy knelt beside him, close enough to feel his labored breathing, he simply laid his great head back down, as if surrendering to whatever fate she represented. The wound was worse than she'd thought, a deep puncture, likely from another male's claws during a territorial dispute. Without treatment, infection would kill him within days. Dorothy worked quickly, cleaning the wound with precious bottled water, while Magnus remained still as stone. "You're being awfully cooperative for the king of beasts," she told him, threading a needle with steady hands. "Must know I'm trying to help." As she began stitching, Magnus turned his head to watch her work. James stood guard nearby, rifle ready, but the anticipated attack never came. Instead, something miraculous happened. Magnus began to purr, a deep rumble that vibrated through Dorothy's bones like distant thunder. 3 hours later, Dorothy had used nearly her entire medical supply. She'd administered antibiotics that cost $3,000. Money she couldn't afford to spend, money her children would say she'd wasted. But as she bandaged Magnus's shoulder with strips torn from her own shirt, she felt more purposeful than she had in years. "There," she said, sitting back on her heels. "That should hold you, Your Majesty." Magnus struggled to his feet. testing his weight on the injured leg. Then, in a moment that would replay in Dorothy's mind for the rest of her life, he turned and pressed his massive forehead against her shoulder, a gesture so gentle, so unmistakably grateful, that tears sprang to her eyes. That evening, as they made camp nearby to monitor Magnus's recovery, Dorothy's satellite phone rang. Michael's face appeared on the small screen, red with fury. "Mom, I just got your credit card statement. $3,000 for veterinary supplies." "Have you lost your mind?" Dorothy looked across the campfire to where Magnus lay resting, his breathing already stronger. "I saved a life today, Michael. When's the last time you could say that?" "You're dying, Mom. That money could have bought you another month, maybe 2. "And I chose to spend it on hope instead of fear," Dorothy replied quietly. "Your father would understand." Michael's expression softened momentarily before hardening again. "Dad's been dead 15 years. It's time you joined the living." After ending the call, Dorothy sat in the African darkness, listening to the symphony of the wild. Tomorrow she would have to decide whether to extend her visa or return home to die surrounded by disappointment. But tonight, under a canopy of stars Harold had once described in his letters, she felt more alive than she had in decades. 2 weeks passed like pages turning in a dream Dorothy never wanted to wake from. Magnus's recovery exceeded every expectation. The infection cleared, his strength returned, and most remarkably, he had not rejoined his pride. Instead, the massive lion had taken to following Dorothy's camp at a respectful distance, appearing each morning like a golden guardian angel and disappearing into the grasslands each night. "This is not normal behavior," James admitted, watching Magnus through binoculars as the lion lay beneath an acacia tree, his amber eyes fixed on Dorothy's tent. "In 30 years of guiding, I have never seen anything like this." Dorothy emerged from her tent, moving more slowly than she had 2 weeks ago. The African sun had bronzed her skin, but the cancer was making its presence known with increasing fatigue and a persistent cough that kept her awake at night. She waved at Magnus, and impossibly the great cat lifted his head in acknowledgement. "Maybe he's just being polite," Dorothy said with a grin that didn't quite hide her growing pain. "Mama raised me to always thank folks who help you out." But politeness didn't explain what happened next. As Dorothy walked toward the stream to wash her face, she stumbled over a hidden rock and fell hard, crying out as pain shot through her arthritic knee. Before James could reach her, Magnus appeared as if materialized from thin air, positioning his massive body between Dorothy and a family of warthogs that had been grazing nearby, animals that posed no real threat but had scattered at the sound of her distress. "Good Lord," Dorothy breathed, looking up into eyes that seemed to hold an almost human intelligence. "You really are watching out for me, aren't you?" That afternoon, Dorothy's satellite phone buzzed with an incoming video call. Sarah's face appeared on the screen, but something was different. Her usual composed demeanor had cracked, revealing the frightened daughter beneath the confident physician. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said, about making choices." Sarah's voice carried across continents, thin and vulnerable. "I want to come see you. I want to understand what you're doing out there." Dorothy's heart swelled with hope. "Oh, honey, I would love that. But it's expensive, and I know you're busy with—" "I'm not busy, Mom. I'm just scared." Sarah's confession hung in the digital space between them. "I'm scared of losing you, and I'm scared of watching you waste away, and I'm scared that maybe you're doing something I'm too much of a coward to do myself." 3 days later, Sarah Williams stepped off a small charter plane at a dusty airstrip in the Mara, her designer luggage comically out of place among the safari gear. Dorothy waited in the shade of the Land Rover, thinner than Sarah remembered, but with eyes that blazed with a vitality that had been absent for years. "Mom, you look—" Sarah began, then stopped, her medical training warring with her emotions. "Like I'm dying?" Because I am, sweetheart. But I'm also living. Dorothy pulled her daughter into a fierce embrace. Thank you for coming. The reunion might have been perfect if not for what happened next. As they drove toward camp, Sarah caught sight of Magnus lounging beneath his favorite acacia tree and let out a sharp gasp. Mom, there's a lion right there. A male lion just watching us. That's Magnus, Dorothy said casually, as if introducing a neighbor. He's the one I told you about. Sarah's physician's mind reeled. Mom, that animal is dangerous. You can't just... She never finished the sentence. As if summoned by some invisible signal, Magnus rose to his feet and began walking directly toward their vehicle. Sarah scrambled for the radio to call for help, but Dorothy placed a gentle hand on her arm. Trust me, honey. Just this once. Magnus approached the Land Rover with the measured dignity of royalty, his massive paws silent on the dry earth. When he reached Dorothy's side of the vehicle, he sat back on his haunches and looked directly at her, then shifted his gaze to Sarah, studying, evaluating, making some kind of leonine judgment. Then, in a gesture that would haunt Sarah's dreams for years to come, Magnus dipped his great head in what could only be described as a bow. Jesus Christ, Sarah whispered. Mom, what have you done? That evening, as they sat around the campfire with Magnus visible in the firelight's edge, Dorothy told her daughter about Harold's journals, pages she had discovered only after his death, describing his time in Kenya as a young soldier. Your father saved a lion cub in 1975, Dorothy said, pulling out a weathered notebook with Harold's careful handwriting. Right here, in this same area. He wrote about it every day for a week. This little golden cub with amber eyes and a scar on his left shoulder from the poachers who killed his mother. Sarah looked from the journal to Magnus, noting the distinctive scar that ran across the lion's left shoulder. Mom, that's impossible. Lions don't live that long. No, Dorothy agreed quietly, but their children do, and their children's children. As if responding to his name in the old journal, Magnus rose and padded closer to the fire. In the dancing light, Sarah could see the intelligence in his eyes, the almost human awareness that defied everything she understood about animal behavior. He knows, doesn't he? Sarah whispered. Somehow he knows what Dad did for his family. Dorothy nodded, reaching out to touch the photograph tucked into Harold's journal. A young soldier kneeling beside a lion cub, both of them squinting into the African sun. Some debts run deeper than blood, honey. Some gratitude gets passed down like genes. That night, as Sarah lay in her tent listening to the sounds of the African wilderness, she heard her mother coughing, harsh, wet sounds that spoke of borrowed time running out. But she also heard something else, the deep, rhythmic breathing of a lion keeping watch just outside the camp's perimeter. For the first time since childhood, Sarah Williams fell asleep, feeling completely safe. Sarah stayed for 10 days, and in that time she witnessed something that challenged everything her medical training had taught her about the boundaries between species. Magnus didn't just watch over Dorothy. He seemed to understand her needs with an intuition that bordered on supernatural. When Dorothy's coughing fits grew severe, the lion would appear at the edge of camp, his low rumbles somehow soothing her distress. When she struggled with weakness, he would position himself near her favorite sitting spot, as if offering his strength. I've never seen anything like it, Sarah admitted to James on her last evening. It's like he can sense her pain. James nodded knowingly. My grandmother would say Magnus carries the spirit of Mrs. Dorothy's husband. In Maasai tradition, gratitude creates bonds that death cannot break. The next morning, Sarah had to return to Denver, a surgery schedule that couldn't wait, patients who needed her expertise. The goodbye was harder than either woman expected. I understand now, Mom, Sarah said, tears flowing freely. You're not running away from anything. You're running toward something we lost when Dad died. "He's still here, honey," Dorothy whispered, glancing toward Magnus, who watched their farewell from his usual spot. "In different ways, but he's still here." After Sarah's departure, Dorothy's health began to decline more rapidly. The African climate, which had initially energized her, now seemed to drain her remaining strength. Her visa would expire in 2 weeks, and the Kenyan authorities had made it clear that extensions were difficult to obtain, especially for a terminally ill American with limited resources. The financial crisis came to a head when Dorothy received her credit card statement via satellite internet. Between medical supplies for Magnus, extended safari fees, and her mounting medical expenses, she had burned through her modest savings at an alarming rate. The house in Millfield would have to be sold, her last connection to the life she'd built with Harold. That evening, Michael called with news that felt like a physical blow. "Mom, I've been in touch with the real estate agent. The house sold, but after the outstanding mortgage and back taxes, there's barely enough left to cover your medical bills when you get home." His voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had spent weeks cleaning up what he saw as his mother's financial recklessness. "You need to come back now before you're completely broke." Dorothy sat in her camp chair, watching Magnus in the fading light. The lion had been acting strangely all day, restless, pacing, occasionally looking toward the horizon as if sensing something she couldn't perceive. "What if I don't want to come back?" she asked quietly. Michael's silence stretched across continents before he exploded. "What if you don't? Mom, are you seriously considering dying in Kenya, alone? What about Sarah? What about me? Don't we deserve to say goodbye properly?" "You could have said goodbye properly 3 months ago," Dorothy replied, surprised by the steel in her own voice. "Instead, you told me I was wasting my life." "Because you were. Because you are." Michael's frustration bled through the connection. "You chose a wild animal over your own family." The accusation hit harder than Dorothy expected, mainly because it carried a grain of truth. She had chosen Magnus, chosen this strange connection that defied logic. But it wasn't a choice made lightly or selfishly. It was a choice made from a place of such deep loneliness that saving another creature had become her salvation. After the call ended, Dorothy walked to where Magnus lay resting. Without hesitation, she sat beside him, something that still made James nervous despite weeks of witnessing their unusual bond. Magnus shifted slightly, allowing her to lean against his massive flank, his body warm and solid against her frail frame. "They think I'm crazy," she told him, her fingers finding the scar tissue along his shoulder. "Maybe they're right. Maybe a dying old woman should be home with her family instead of playing guardian angel to a lion in Africa." Magnus turned his great head to look at her, and Dorothy swore she saw understanding in those amber eyes. Not just animal intelligence, but something deeper, more connected to the human experience than any scientific study would support. 3 days later, everything changed. Dorothy was walking to the stream for her morning wash when dizziness overtook her. She stumbled, caught herself against a tree, and felt the warm trickle of blood from her nose, a sign that the cancer was advancing more aggressively than expected. As she struggled to regain her balance, she heard voices approaching through the bush, rough, unfamiliar voices speaking in accented English. "Tracks fresher here. Big male, traveling alone. Perfect for the Chinese market." Dorothy's blood ran cold. Poachers. She tried to move quickly back toward camp, but her weakened legs betrayed her, and she fell heavily beside the stream. The voices grew closer, accompanied by the metallic sound of weapons being readied. "There," came a harsh whisper, "under the big acacia. Magnificent bastard." Through the vegetation, Dorothy could see Magnus in his usual resting spot, unaware of the danger approaching. The poachers were setting up what looked like tranquilizer equipment. They wanted him alive for transport, which meant a slow, terrifying death in captivity. Dorothy forced herself to her feet, every instinct screaming at her to run, to hide, to save herself. Instead, she stumbled toward Magnus, gasping his name. The lion's head snapped up at her approach, and he immediately rose to his feet, sensing her distress. The lead poacher emerged from the bush, a weathered white man in military fatigues with the distinctive limp of a veteran. When he saw Dorothy, his expression shifted from surprise to cold calculation. "Well, well, American tourist, you picked a hell of a time for a morning stroll, lady." Dorothy positioned herself between the man and Magnus, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You can't take him. He's protected by the Conservancy." The man laughed, revealing teeth stained by years of tobacco use. "Protected? Lady, everything's for sale out here if you know the right people. That cat's worth more than you'll see in a lifetime." "His name is Magnus," Dorothy said firmly, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "And he's not for sale." Behind her, she could feel Magnus's presence, a wall of muscle and controlled power. The poacher's eyes flicked nervously between Dorothy and the lion, clearly recalculating his approach. "You're making this complicated, Grandma. Walk away, and nobody gets hurt." Dorothy thought of Harold, of the young soldier who had once stood between a lion cub and certain death. She thought of her children, who would read about this moment in tomorrow's newspapers and finally understand what she had been trying to tell them about purpose and meaning and the connections that make life worth living. "No," she said simply. "I won't walk away." The poacher raised his tranquilizer gun, but before he could fire, Magnus moved, not attacking. Dorothy had seen enough nature documentaries to know what a lion attack looked like, but positioning himself beside her, his massive frame a clear warning to anyone who might threaten his strange, fragile guardian. "Jesus Christ," one of the other poachers whispered. "That thing's protecting her." The standoff stretched into eternity, Dorothy's labored breathing the only sound in the African morning. She could feel her strength ebbing, black spots dancing at the edges of her vision, but she refused to back down. This moment, this choice between safety and sacrifice, felt like the culmination of everything she had been moving toward since Harold's death. The lead poacher's finger tightened on the trigger just as James's Land Rover roared into the clearing, followed by two Conservancy vehicles filled with armed rangers. The poachers scattered like startled birds, disappearing into the bush with the practiced efficiency of men accustomed to running. As Dorothy collapsed into James's arms, she felt Magnus's warm breath on her face, a gentle goodbye that spoke of understanding deeper than words. The lion padded away into the grasslands, safe for another day, while Dorothy was rushed to the nearest medical facility with James muttering prayers in Ma. And that evening, as Dorothy lay in a hospital bed in Nairobi, her satellite phone rang. Michael's face appeared on the screen, and for the first time in months, he wasn't angry. "James called me," he said quietly. "He told me what you did today." Dorothy nodded weakly, too exhausted for conversation. "Mom, I've been thinking about what Dad would say if he could see you now." Michael's voice cracked slightly. "I think he'd be proud. I think he'd say you finally found what you've been looking for." Through the hospital window, Dorothy could see the lights of Nairobi twinkling in the darkness. Somewhere out there, Magnus was settling down for the night, carrying with him the knowledge that humans could choose courage over comfort, love over logic. For the first time since leaving Illinois, Dorothy Williams felt truly at peace. The confrontation with the poachers had taken more out of Dorothy than anyone realized. What the doctors initially dismissed as exhaustion from the ordeal soon revealed itself as something far more serious. The cancer had accelerated, spreading with the aggressive hunger of a wildfire. Dr. Patel at Nairobi General Hospital delivered the news with the gentle firmness that Dorothy recognized from her own nursing days. "Mrs. Williams, I'm afraid the stress of recent events has compromised your immune system significantly. The tumors have grown and your body is showing signs of systemic failure." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "We're looking at weeks now, not months." Dorothy absorbed this information with the stoic acceptance of someone who had spent a lifetime witnessing the fragility of human existence. "How many weeks, doctor?" "2, perhaps 3, with palliative care." "I strongly recommend we contact your family immediately." That afternoon, Dorothy made the hardest phone call of her life. Sarah answered on the second ring, her voice bright with the artificial cheer of someone trying to stay positive. "Mom, how are you feeling? James said you're in the hospital, but he made it sound like just a precaution." "Sarah, honey, I need you to sit down." Dorothy's voice carried a finality that cut through her daughter's optimism like a scalpel. "The cancer has spread. I'm not coming home." The silence that followed stretched across continents, filled with all the conversations they should have had, all the time they had wasted on smaller concerns. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "How long?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. Sarah's sob came through the connection like a physical blow. "Mom, no. There has to be something. Experimental treatments, clinical trials." "I can fly you to Johns Hopkins, to Mayo Clinic." "Baby, I'm done fighting. I want to spend whatever time I have left where I feel closest to your father." Dorothy looked out the hospital window toward the direction of the Mara, where Magnus was undoubtedly wondering why she hadn't returned. "Will you come, both of you?" Michael arrived first, catching the next available flight out of JFK and landing in Nairobi looking haggard and desperate. When he walked into Dorothy's hospital room, the sight of his mother, frail, yellowed, diminished to a shadow of the formidable woman who had raised him, broke something fundamental inside him. "Mom," he whispered, taking her hand in both of his, "I'm so sorry. For everything I said, for not understanding." "Hush, now," Dorothy soothed, her voice paper-thin but warm. "You're here. That's what matters." Sarah arrived 24 hours later, having rearranged her entire surgical schedule and left her practice in the hands of colleagues. The reunion was bittersweet. 3 people finally coming together just as time was running out to heal old wounds. "I want to go back to the Mara," Dorothy told them that evening. "I want to die under the stars your father wrote about." Both children began to protest. The medical facilities, the lack of proper palliative care, the danger. But Dorothy cut them off with a look that reminded them exactly whose daughter they were. "I've made my peace with dying. Now, I need you to make your peace with letting me go where I choose." The next morning, against medical advice and with a stack of liability waivers, Dorothy Williams made her final journey into the Kenyan wilderness. James had prepared a comfortable camp near Magnus's territory, complete with a medical tent and satellite communication for emergencies. Dr. Patel had reluctantly agreed to provide morphine for pain management, along with strict instructions about dosages and warning signs. Magnus appeared within hours of their arrival, emerging from the golden grassland like a vision from a dream. The great lion approached the camp slowly, his amber eyes fixed not on Dorothy but on her children, assessing, judging, making some decision that only he understood. "My God," Michael breathed, watching the massive predator settle down 50 yards from their campfire as if he belonged there. "He really has been watching over you." For 3 days they lived in a strange harmony. Dying mother, grieving children, and watchful lion existing in a bubble outside normal reality. Dorothy grew weaker each day, but her spirits remained high. She told stories about Harold, shared memories from her nursing days, and watched her children slowly rediscover the people they had been before life convinced them that love was a luxury they couldn't afford. On the 4th day, Dorothy suffered her first major crisis. The morphine could no longer touch the pain that racked her body, and her breathing became labored and irregular. Sarah, drawing on every skill from her medical training, did what she could to make her mother comfortable. But they all knew the end was approaching. That evening, as Dorothy drifted in and out of consciousness, something extraordinary happened. Magnus rose from his usual position and began walking toward their camp. James reached for his rifle, but Michael stopped him. "Wait. Let's see what he does." The lion approached Dorothy's tent with the measured dignity of a monarch visiting a beloved subject. When he reached her bedside, he lowered his massive head and gently nuzzled her hand, the same hand that had stitched his wounds, the same hand that had saved his life. Dorothy's eyes fluttered open, and she smiled with an expression of such pure joy that both her children began to cry. "Hello, Magnus," she whispered. "I was hoping you'd come say goodbye." The lion settled beside her makeshift bed, his warm bulk a comforting presence in the gathering darkness. For the first time in days, Dorothy's breathing eased, as if Magnus's presence had somehow shared his strength with her. "He knows," Sarah said wonderfully, her medical skepticism crumbling in the face of something that defied scientific explanation. "He knows what's happening." That night, as Dorothy slipped deeper into unconsciousness, Magnus never left her side. He remained perfectly still, occasionally lifting his great head to look at Michael and Sarah as if to reassure them that they were not alone in their vigil. The end came just before dawn, as the African sky began to lighten with the promise of another day Dorothy would not see. Her breathing simply grew quieter and quieter until it stopped altogether, her face peaceful in the growing light. Magnus lifted his head and released a single, mournful roar that echoed across the savannah, a sound so filled with grief that it seemed to encompass all the loss and love that had brought them to this moment. "Oh, Mom," Sarah sobbed, taking her mother's still warm hand. "I love you. We love you so much." Michael stood frozen, watching as Magnus gently nuzzled Dorothy's face one final time before rising to his feet. The lion looked at each of them in turn, as if imprinting their faces in his memory, then padded away into the grassland, disappearing like a golden ghost in the morning mist. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, her voice hollow with exhaustion and grief. James, who had witnessed the entire vigil with the quiet reverence of someone who understood that sacred moments demanded silence, finally spoke. "Now we honor her wishes, Mrs. Dorothy wanted to be cremated here, in the place where she found her peace. As they prepared Dorothy's body according to her detailed instructions, Michael found himself thinking about the woman his mother had become in her final months. Not the bitter widow he had known, but the vibrant spirit who had rediscovered purpose in the most unlikely place. She had saved a lion, and in return, the lion had saved her from dying alone and forgotten. She was right, he told Sarah as they watched the sunrise paint the Mara in shades of gold. Dad would have been proud. In the distance, carried on the morning wind, they heard Magnus's roar once more. Not mournful this time, but strong and vital, a sound that spoke of life continuing even in the face of loss. Dorothy Williams had come to Kenya to die. Instead, she had remembered how to live. The days following Dorothy's death passed in a haze of grief and bureaucratic complexity that seemed designed to drain the meaning from even the most sacred moments. Kenyan authorities required extensive documentation for the cremation of a foreign national, while the American embassy demanded forms in triplicate to repatriate her remains. Michael, drawing on his legal expertise, navigated the maze of regulations with grim efficiency, but every signature felt like another small betrayal of his mother's final wishes. Sarah remained at the camp, unable to bring herself to leave the place where Dorothy had found her peace. She sat for hours in her mother's favorite spot, watching the horizon for any sign of Magnus, but the lion had vanished as completely as morning mist. James assured her this was normal behavior. Wild animals often withdrew after traumatic events, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something essential had been broken by Dorothy's passing. "Maybe he's grieving too," she told Michael during one of their nightly satellite phone calls. "Maybe he understands what we've lost." Michael's response was characteristically practical. "Sarah, you need to come back to reality. You've been out there too long. That animal was responding to stimuli we don't understand, but he wasn't forming emotional attachments like a human would." But even as he spoke, Michael found himself questioning his own certainty. He had witnessed something at his mother's deathbed that challenged every rational explanation he could construct. The image of Magnus maintaining his vigil through Dorothy's final night haunted him with its implications about the nature of connection and consciousness. The cremation took place on a windswept hill overlooking the Masai Mara, with only Michael, Sarah, James, and a handful of local conservancy workers in attendance. As Dorothy's body was committed to flames that seemed to dance in harmony with the African wind, Sarah felt a profound sense of completion. Her mother was becoming part of the landscape she had loved, her atoms joining the eternal cycle of the savannah. "She's home now," James said quietly, his weathered face reflecting the firelight. In Maasai tradition, we believe the spirits of those who love the land become part of it forever. As the ceremony concluded, a familiar sound echoed across the grassland, Magnus's distinctive roar, deeper and more resonant than any other lion in the region. The mourners looked toward the sound's source and saw a magnificent silhouette against the setting sun, watching from a distant ridge as if paying his own respects to the woman who had saved his life. The next morning brought the first of several disturbing discoveries that would transform their grief into something far more complex. Sarah was packing her mother's belongings when she found Dorothy's satellite phone hidden beneath medical supplies. The device showed dozens of missed calls and unread messages, all from an unknown international number. When Sarah finally answered the persistent caller, a woman's voice came through the static-filled connection. "Mrs. Williams, thank God. This is Dr. Rebecca Chen from the Wildlife Conservation Foundation. I've been trying to reach you for weeks. This is Dorothy's daughter, Sarah. I'm afraid my mother passed away 3 days ago." The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably before Dr. Chen spoke again, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry for your loss, but I need to tell you something about what your mother did here. Something she made me promise to keep secret until—" Dr. Chen's revelation shattered everything Sarah thought she understood about her mother's final months. Dorothy hadn't simply stumbled upon Magnus by chance. She had been in contact with the Wildlife Conservation Foundation since before leaving Illinois, participating in a groundbreaking study about human-animal bonding in terminal patients. The foundation had been documenting her interactions with Magnus as part of research into whether animals could provide therapeutic benefits for the dying. "Your mother was our most remarkable subject," Dr. Chen explained. "The bond she formed with that lion was unprecedented in our research, but she insisted we couldn't reveal the study's existence until after her death. She said she didn't want her children thinking she had gone to Kenya for any reason other than her own choice." Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her understanding of recent events. "So the whole thing was, what, some kind of experiment?" "No," Dr. Chen said firmly. "The emotions were real, the connection was real. We simply provided the framework that allowed your mother to safely pursue what she needed to do. The lion responded to her on his own terms." When Sarah shared this information with Michael, his reaction was explosive. "She lied to us. All that talk about finding herself, about spiritual connections, it was all part of some academic study." But as they dug deeper into Dorothy's hidden communications, a more nuanced picture emerged. Their mother had indeed initially contacted the foundation seeking a way to interact safely with African wildlife, but her relationship with Magnus had quickly transcended the study's parameters. The researchers had been as surprised as anyone by the depth of the bond that developed. "Look at this," Sarah said, scrolling through encrypted emails on Dorothy's laptop. She kept asking Dr. Chen to stop monitoring her interactions with Magnus. She said the cameras and data collection were violating something sacred. The final email, sent just days before Dorothy's death, contained a single line that crystallized her transformation from research subject to something far more profound. "Please delete all footage and data. Some connections are too precious to be reduced to scientific observation." 3 days later, another shock arrived in the form of an unexpected visitor. Dr. Chen appeared at their camp, having flown in from Nairobi with a team of wildlife veterinarians and a story that cast Magnus in an entirely new light. "We've been tracking Magnus since before your mother arrived," Dr. Chen explained, setting up a laptop filled with data that painted a picture of the lion's extraordinary life. "He's not just any lion, he's descended from a bloodline we've been studying for decades." The veterinary records revealed that Magnus's grandmother had been the subject of a legendary rescue operation in the 1970s, when a young American soldier had intervened to save a lion cub from poachers. The soldier's name was listed in the Foundation's historical files: Harold Williams. "Your father," Dr. Chen said quietly, "saved Magnus's family line. When your mother appeared 49 years later and saved Magnus himself, she was completing a circle of protection that spanned generations." Sarah stared at the photograph Dr. Chen produced, a faded image of a young Harold kneeling beside a golden lion cub, both of them squinting into the African sun. The resemblance between the cub and adult Magnus was unmistakable, from the distinctive amber eyes to the unique pattern of markings around his muzzle. "This is impossible," Michael said, his lawyer's mind rejecting the implications. "You're suggesting some kind of genetic memory, like Magnus somehow inherited knowledge about our family?" Dr. Chen shrugged. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm simply presenting the facts. Whether lions can inherit behavioral patterns, whether they can recognize genetic markers, whether there's something we don't understand about animal consciousness, those are questions for philosophers, not scientists." That evening, as if summoned by the revelation of his heritage, Magnus returned to the camp for the first time since Dorothy's death. He approached slowly, his massive frame moving with the careful dignity of royalty, and settled in the exact spot where Dorothy had spent her final hours. But something was different about the lion's demeanor. Where before he had exuded calm authority, now there was a restlessness, an urgency that made James nervous enough to keep his rifle close. "He's trying to tell us something," Sarah said, watching Magnus pace in tight circles before returning to his vigil position. "Look at how he keeps looking toward the horizon." Magnus repeated this pattern throughout the night, pacing, looking, returning to his post by Dorothy's former campsite. When dawn broke, the reason for his agitation became clear. On the distant horizon, a line of vehicles was approaching, the distinctive green trucks of the Kenya Wildlife Service, followed by what appeared to be a convoy of unmarked black SUVs. "Poachers," James said grimly, recognizing the signs of an organized operation. "The same ones who tried to take Magnus before. They've come back with more men." As the vehicles drew closer, Sarah realized with growing horror that their mother's death had removed the one thing that had kept Magnus safe, Dorothy's protective presence. Without her there to witness and document any attempts on the lion's life, he had become vulnerable to the same criminal networks that had threatened him weeks earlier. "We have to do something," Sarah said, feeling the weight of inherited responsibility settling on her shoulders like a mantle passed down through generations. Michael looked at his sister, then at Magnus, then at the approaching vehicles that represented everything their mother had fought against in her final months. For the first time since arriving in Kenya, he understood what Dorothy had been trying to tell them about purpose and meaning, and the connections that make life worth fighting for. Yes, he said quietly. We do. The convoy stopped just beyond rifle range, and through binoculars Michael could see men in military fatigues setting up what looked like a sophisticated operation. This wasn't the ragtag group of poachers Dorothy had faced. This was a well-funded, organized assault on Magnus and possibly the entire conservation area. How many? James asked, his voice tight with the controlled tension of someone who had survived similar situations before. 12, maybe 15, Michael replied, surprised by his own calm. Professional equipment, coordinated movements. They're not here for a quick grab. Dr. Chen, who had remained at the camp to complete her research documentation, emerged from her tent with a satellite phone pressed to her ear. Her face was grim as she ended the call. That was my contact at the Kenya Wildlife Service, she announced. Those aren't just poachers. They're part of an international syndicate that's been targeting specific animals for wealthy collectors. Magnus has been on their list for months. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. They waited until Mom died. They knew she was protecting him somehow. The truth of that statement hit everyone simultaneously. Dorothy's presence, her daily documentation, her constant communication with conservation groups and family back home, all of it had created a protective web of international attention around Magnus. With her gone, that protection had evaporated overnight. Magnus seemed to sense the approaching danger. The great lion rose from his vigil position and began pacing in wider circles, his amber eyes fixed on the distant vehicles. Every few minutes he would release a low rumble, not quite a roar, but a sound that vibrated through the ground and spoke of barely contained power. He knows, James said wonderingly. Look at his posture, the way he's positioning himself. He's preparing for a fight. But even as they watched Magnus ready himself for battle, Sarah realized the futility of the situation. One lion, no matter how magnificent, couldn't stand against 15 armed men with tranquilizer guns and capture equipment. Magnus would be taken, and everything Dorothy had died trying to protect would be lost. We need to call for help, she said, reaching for the satellite phone. Dr. Chen shook her head. I already tried. The nearest wildlife rangers are 4 hours away, and the poachers have been jamming radio frequencies. We're on our own. Michael stood silently for a long moment, watching the tactical deployment of the poaching team with the analytical mind that had made him successful in courtrooms. Then, to everyone's surprise, he began to smile. Not necessarily, he said. I've been thinking about something Mom said, about Dad and the choices he made out here. She kept Harold's journal, right? The one where he wrote about saving Magnus's ancestor? Sarah nodded, confused by the apparent non sequitur. It's in her things. Why? Because Dad wasn't just any soldier. He was Special Forces, and according to his journal entries, he spent 3 months training with Kenyan Rangers in anti-poaching operations. Michael's smile widened as pieces of a half-formed plan began clicking into place. He would have mapped this entire area, identified defensive positions, documented water sources and escape routes. James caught on first. You think his notes might still be useful? I think my father was the kind of man who prepared for contingencies that might not arise for 50 years. Michael was already moving toward Dorothy's belongings. And I think Mom knew exactly what she was doing when she brought his journal to Kenya. Harold's journal proved to be far more than a sentimental keepsake. Tucked between pages of personal reflections were detailed tactical maps of the Masai Mara, complete with elevation markers, water sources, and what appeared to be carefully marked defensive positions. Harold Williams had indeed been preparing for a war that wouldn't come for decades. Here, Michael said, pointing to a series of notations near their current location. Dad marked 3 observation posts on these ridges, with clear sight lines covering the entire approach to this valley. If someone were positioned at each point, we could create crossfire that would make any advance impossible, James finished, his respect for the long-dead American soldier evident in his voice. But that requires 3 people with military training and proper weapons. Dr. Chen surprised them all by speaking up. I did 2 tours in Afghanistan as a combat medic before I became a wildlife researcher. And I brought my hunting rifle for protection against aggressive animals. Sarah looked at these 3 people, a Kenyan guide, a Chinese-American scientist, and her Wall Street lawyer brother, and felt something shift in her understanding of what was possible when ordinary people faced extraordinary circumstances. "What about me?" she asked. Michael studied his sister's face, seeing for the first time the steel that had carried her through medical school and years of pediatric surgery. "You're the most important piece. Magnus trusts you now. You're the only one who can guide him to safety while we buy you time." As they implemented Harold's 50-year-old battle plan, Sarah found herself running across the African savanna with a lion at her side, following escape routes mapped by her father before she was born. Magnus moved with her as if they had been partners for years, responding to her gestures and staying close enough to provide protection without hindering her movement. Behind them, the sound of gunfire echoed across the grassland as Michael, James, and Dr. Chen engaged the poaching team from Harold's carefully chosen positions. The plan was working. The poachers were pinned down, unable to advance or retreat without exposing themselves to crossfire from the ridges. But as Sarah and Magnus approached the coordinates Harold had marked as a safe rally point, they encountered an obstacle no 50-year-old map could have predicted. Bobby Martinez, the scarred veteran who had led the original poaching attempt, was waiting for them with a high-powered rifle and the cold patience of someone who had learned to hunt humans in urban warfare. "End of the line, lady," Bobby called out, his weapon trained on Magnus. "That cat's coming with me, one way or another." Sarah found herself in the exact position her mother had faced weeks earlier, standing between Magnus and someone who wanted to destroy him. But unlike Dorothy, Sarah had the advantage of youth, medical training, and the tactical knowledge Harold's journal had provided. "You're Bobby Martinez," she said, buying time while her mind raced through possibilities. "James told me about you. Lost your leg in Afghanistan, right? IED outside Kandahar?" Bobby's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What's it to you?" "My mom was an Army nurse in Vietnam. She spent 40 years treating guys like you, soldiers who came home broken and angry and looking for something to blame." Sarah took a careful step forward, noting how Bobby favored his prosthetic leg. "She would have understood why you're doing this. Your mom was a bleeding heart fool who got herself killed protecting an animal," Bobby snarled. "I'm a realist. That cat's worth $2 million to the right buyer, and I've got medical bills that don't care about conservation." Sarah nodded sympathetically, continuing her slow advance. She was a fool. But she was also right about something. Some connections run deeper than money. Before Bobby could react, Magnus made his move. Not an attack, but something far more unexpected. The great lion lay down on the ground between Sarah and the armed man, exposing his belly in a gesture of complete vulnerability and trust. "What the hell?" Bobby stammered, his rifle wavering as he tried to process what he was seeing. "He's surrendering," Sarah said softly. "He's choosing to trust that I'll protect him, the same way my mother protected him, the same way my father protected his family 50 years ago." In that moment of stunned silence, Sarah heard the distant sound of helicopter rotors, the Kenya Wildlife Service finally arriving with reinforcements drawn by the gunfire. The standoff was over, but Bobby still held a weapon capable of ending Magnus's life with a single shot. $2 million, Sarah said quietly. "That's what you said he's worth." "What if I told you there was a way to make that money without killing him?" Bobby's laugh was bitter. Lady, I'm not in the mood for fairy tales. The Wildlife Conservation Foundation has a reward program for information leading to the arrest of international poaching syndicates, Sarah continued, gambling everything on a desperate bluff. The men you're working with? They've been on Interpol's most wanted list for years, turned state's evidence, and the reward money could set you up for life. As helicopters circled overhead and the sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, Bobby Martinez faced the same choice Dorothy Williams had confronted in her final months: the easy path of cynicism and self-preservation, or the harder road of doing something that mattered. He lowered his rifle. "Your mom really died protecting this cat?" he asked, looking down at Magnus with something approaching respect. "She died protecting the idea that some things are more valuable than money," Sarah replied, "including the chance for broken people to heal." Bobby Martinez surrendered to the wildlife rangers 20 minutes later, providing information that would ultimately lead to the dismantling of one of East Africa's largest poaching networks. But as Sarah knelt beside Magnus in the aftermath, feeling the great cat's steady breathing against her palm, she knew the real victory was smaller and more personal: the continuation of a chain of protection that had bound her family to this magnificent creature across 2 generations. The lion who had attended Dorothy Williams' deathbed vigil would live to see another sunrise, carrying with him the genetic memory of gratitude that connected past to future in ways that transcended human understanding. 2 years later, Dorothy Williams' memorial service drew an unexpected crowd to the small cemetery in Millfield, Illinois. What had begun as a simple family gathering to commemorate the 2nd anniversary of her death had evolved into something unprecedented: a celebration that brought together conservation scientists, Maasai elders, former military personnel, and animal lovers from around the world. The memorial itself was modest: a granite headstone bearing Dorothy's name alongside Harold's, with a small bronze plaque depicting a lion's silhouette against an African sunset. But surrounding the gravesite were hundreds of flowers, letters, and photographs left by people whose lives had been touched by Dorothy's story. Michael stood at the podium that had been erected for the occasion, looking out at faces that represented his mother's unlikely legacy. In the front row sat Bobby Martinez, now working as a rehabilitation counselor for disabled veterans, his transformation from poacher to protector serving as a living testament to the possibility of redemption. Behind him, Dr. Rebecca Chen held a tablet displaying a live video feed from Kenya, where James Kimani waited to share the latest news about Magnus. "My mother would have been bewildered by all this attention," Michael began, his voice carrying the easy confidence he had inherited from Dorothy. "She always said she was just doing what felt right in the moment. But what we've learned over these past 2 years is that sometimes the smallest acts of courage create ripples that change everything." The Dorothy Williams Foundation, established with the reward money from Bobby's information about the poaching syndicate, had grown into a major force in wildlife conservation. More importantly, it had pioneered a revolutionary approach to end-of-life care that paired terminally ill patients with animal rescue operations, creating healing connections for both humans and creatures in need. Sarah had left her practice in Denver to become the Foundation's medical director, designing programs that brought together hospice patients and rescued wildlife in carefully supervised environments. The results had been remarkable. Patients experienced reduced pain, improved mood, and a sense of purpose in their final months, while the animals benefited from gentle human contact that aided their rehabilitation. "The program has expanded to 12 facilities across the country," Sarah announced when she took the podium, "and the waiting list grows every day." "Turns out Mom wasn't as crazy as we thought. There really is something healing about the connection between species facing mortality." But the most powerful moment of the ceremony came when James activated the video link to Kenya. On the tablet screen, Magnus appeared in magnificent detail, his golden mane fuller than ever, his amber eyes alert and curious as he investigated the camera equipment that had been carefully positioned near his favorite resting spot. Magnus is now the dominant male of a pride of 12, James reported, his voice carrying clearly across the digital divide. He has 4 cubs this season, and his bloodline will continue for generations. But there is something else you should know. James moved the camera to show a small wooden memorial that had been erected near the spot where Dorothy died. It was simple, just a carved plaque with her name and dates. But what made it extraordinary was its condition. Despite being exposed to the harsh African climate for 2 years, the memorial showed no signs of weathering or damage. Magnus visits this place every morning, James explained. He lies beside it for exactly 1 hour, then returns to his pride. The other lions have learned this routine and respect it. Even the youngest cubs seem to understand that this time is sacred. The audience watched in awed silence as Magnus approached the memorial on screen, his massive frame moving with the deliberate grace of ritual. When he reached the wooden plaque, he settled beside it with the same gentle care he had shown during Dorothy's final night, his great head resting peacefully as if he were keeping vigil with an old friend. Some of our Maasai elders say Magnus is teaching his cubs about gratitude, James continued. Whether you believe that or not, the behavior is unprecedented in our decades of lion research. The cubs watch their father during these memorial visits, and they've begun mimicking his respectful behavior around human conservation workers. Dr. Chen took over the presentation, sharing data that had emerged from 2 years of studying the Magnus phenomenon. The research had attracted attention from ethologists worldwide, challenging assumptions about animal cognition and emotional capacity. We've documented similar protective behaviors in other animals that have been rescued by terminally ill patients in our program, she explained. Elephants that remember and mourn their human caregivers. Dolphins that refuse to leave the vicinity of memorial sites. Even domestic animals that seem to inherit protective instincts toward the families of deceased caretakers. But beyond the scientific implications, Dorothy's story had sparked a broader cultural conversation about the meaning of purpose in the face of mortality. Social media was filled with #DorotheaChallenge posts, people sharing stories about choosing courage over comfort, about finding meaning in their remaining time, about connections that transcended the boundaries of species and expectation. Elderly Americans, in particular, had embraced Dorothy as a symbol of refusing to accept invisibility. Nursing homes across the country had established animal therapy programs inspired by her example, while bucket list tourism to conservation areas had become a significant source of funding for wildlife protection efforts. Michael concluded the ceremony by reading from a letter that had arrived that morning from an unexpected source. It was handwritten on official White House stationery bearing the signature of the current president. Dorothy Williams represents the best of American values, the courage to follow conscience over convention, the determination to make a difference regardless of personal cost, and the wisdom to understand that true legacy lies not in what we accumulate, but in what we protect for future generations. As the formal program ended and people began to mingle, sharing their own stories of transformation inspired by Dorothy's example, a small drama unfolded near the memorial headstone. A young girl, perhaps 8 years old, had approached the gravesite with a hand-drawn picture of a lion. "Is this where the Lion Lady is buried?" she asked Sarah with the directness that only children possess. "Yes, sweetie. This is where my mom is resting." The girl carefully placed her drawing among the flowers, then stood solemnly for a moment. "My grandpa says she proved that love doesn't die when people do. Is that true?" Sarah looked around at the crowd of people whose lives had been touched by her mother's story. Former strangers who had become family, connected by their shared belief in the power of choosing courage over comfort. In the distance, she could see the tablet screen still displaying Magnus in his daily vigil, teaching his cubs that some connections transcend mortality. "Yes, honey," Sarah said, kneeling to the girl's level. That's exactly what she proved. As the sun set over Millfield, Illinois, casting long shadows across the cemetery where Dorothy Williams rested beside her beloved Harold, a lion 3,000 miles away rose from his own memorial vigil and padded back to his pride. The circle of protection and gratitude that had begun with a young soldier saving a lion cub in 1975 continued unbroken, carried forward by new generations who understood that love, once given freely, creates bonds that death cannot sever. Dorothy Williams had come to Kenya to die. Instead, she had learned to live forever. Sometimes the most profound journeys begin when we stop running from our fears and start running toward our purpose. Dorothy Williams taught us that it's never too late to discover what truly matters, that courage isn't about being fearless, but about choosing love over comfort, connection over safety, and meaning over mere survival. Her story reminds us that the time we have left isn't measured in years or months, but in moments of authentic connection and acts of unexpected bravery. When Dorothy chose to save Magnus, she wasn't just rescuing a lion, she was rescuing herself from a life of quiet desperation, proving that sometimes our greatest adventures wait on the other side of our deepest fears. Magnus's faithful vigil at her memorial shows us something beautiful. Gratitude creates bonds that transcend species, time, and even death itself. The love we give away doesn't diminish us. It multiplies, creating ripples that touch lives we'll never know. Dorothy's legacy lives on in every person who chooses to matter, who refuses to accept invisibility, who believes that their remaining chapters can be their most meaningful. What if the life you're meant to live is still waiting for you to claim it? Share with us. What dream have you been postponing that could still transform your remaining years? Have you ever experienced an unexpected connection with an animal that changed your perspective on love and loyalty?